Hello, this is Chuck Dunning, and I welcome you to this presentation, The Penetration of the Mysteries and Masonic Intercourse. I'd like to begin with a more extensive introduction than I usually have for my lectures. First, I need to assert that no Mason or group of Masons speaks for all of Masonry. Unless specifically noted otherwise, nothing here expresses the position of any Masonic organization. What follows is very interpretive and from my own personal perspective and speculations. I urge you to listen with your heart, think critically, reflect contemplatively, absorb what is useful, and shelve the rest to perhaps be picked up at some later time. Also, the referenced Masonic symbolism comes from the Preston Webb family of ritual, and more specifically from my experience of ritual in Texas. Ritual and symbolism in other jurisdictions may differ in some respects. Next, I should acknowledge that I've had this presentation available for many years, but in all that time I've only presented it on a few occasions. Some of the reasons for that may already be apparent, but they will become clearer as we proceed. I will be speaking about controversial topics and offering perspectives that won't be agreeable to everyone. If anyone finds this challenging in some ways, then I hope they are challenges that facilitate learning and growth. It is not my intention to be offensive or divisive, only to suggest possibilities that I have found meaningful and transformative in very beneficial ways. I suppose by this presentation's title, it's obvious that I am intentionally using language and imagery with sexual connotations. I hope you keep listening and looking for those words and images, because I will continue using them. I do this in part simply because it's fun, but also because initiation into the mysteries and true engagement with them has a great deal in common with the relationship between loving partners. Initiation is, after all, the pursuit of a love affair filled with romance in the most proper sense of the word romance, which is a feeling of excitement, mystery, and adventure that stimulates the imagination with visions of wonderful possibilities and can lead to experiences of self-transcendence and bliss. As you will soon see, the messages of this presentation are specifically tied to masculine Masonry. It is meant to offer Masons of that tradition useful insights that can benefit their development as more whole, healthy, and mature human beings. My hope is that anyone not of that specific tradition may also find something here that is relevant and useful to their journeys. I also feel a responsibility to acknowledge that the metaphorical language I'm using is primarily heterosexual and draws from the traditional gender binary. As I do so, I ask you to keep in mind that this is because the symbolism of Freemasonry was developed within cultures with such norms. Even today, it's simply a fact that the psyches of most men, but not all, are deeply aligned with those norms, and so, to some extent, although not exclusively, we must work within those parameters in order to effectively address their psycho-spiritual needs. For such men, women and femininity naturally represent all that is most mysterious, most beautiful, and most desirable to experience, to know, and to join with. And the relevance of this attraction will be explored in depth as we proceed. While such symbolism deals in generalizations about both men and women, I want to be clear from the outset that I am not promoting any stereotypes as ideals by which individual human beings should be constrained or judged. In fact, I hope it becomes evident that I advocate for quite the opposite. We just need to face the realities of where we are in order to advance toward where we could go. Speaking of generalizations, I'm aware that the heterosexual and binary symbolism won't personally align with everyone listening to this lecture. For those individuals, I'm glad you're listening anyway, and I beg your indulgence. Along the way, I welcome you to make whatever adaptations are suitable to your own beautiful souls, and I would appreciate your feedback. I trust that we can all learn from each other and grow together. I think that's a huge part of what Masonry is about. So, let's get started with the presentation. Now, that word penetration is a very manly word, don't you think? Actually, a deeper penetration into our manliness is where we start our philosophical intercourse today. These days, there is a lot of talk about manliness. In the name of masculinity, we are inundated by television commercials about cologne and alcoholic beverages, by magazines about cigars and guns, cars and clothing, and by blogs and books about the ways manly men are supposed to walk, talk, eat, be entertained, exercise, and relate to other people. It's a powerful money-making trend, if not a collective obsession. The psychological ploys of marketing to men are, of course, largely profit-driven, and they are aimed at taking advantage of our insecurities and uncertainties. Their intentional manipulation of the little boy within each of us is revealed by the calculated appeal to both our natural need for play and the fears we all have lurking behind our desires to appear stronger, tougher, more competent, and more attractive than we think we really are. In effect, popular culture's trappings of manliness and masculinity amount to little more than grown-up versions of the hero costumes we wanted as boys. Please understand that my point here is not to attack the value of fantasy, role play, and other games for either boys or men, or to deny the value of strength, toughness, competence, or attractiveness. Rather, I mean to point out that there are elements of our society that would bait us into unknowingly putting the brunt of our time and energy into facades of masculinity, into stereotypes, rather than the foundation stones of manhood, and thus have us confuse the appearance for the essence. What has all this to do with Masonry? As Brother Robert Davis has pointed out in his excellent book, Understanding Manhood in America, many young men have been and still are drawn to the lodge as a place to bond with older men and learn from them about manliness. Many of us who are at or beyond middle age also look to our elder brethren for mentoring in what it means to be a man of dignity and value in our later years. Beyond this, everything in masculine masonry, when rightly understood, from its foundations in the entered apprentice degree to its highest offices, is contemplative labor involving the essence and the expression of manliness in one way or another. So, how is it that we can do this work? We call our work by many names: the craft, the builder's art, the search for light, and so on. Yet when our rituals speak most plainly and directly about this path of manliness, they use the word virtue. The Latin root of virtue is vir or vir, meaning man, the same root as in our word virile. For us, the true art of manliness is thus the cultivation of the spiritual, intellectual, emotional, and behavioral qualities that we laud as the virtues of Masonry. Therefore, every entered apprentice learns about the 4 cardinal and 3 theological virtues: prudence, temperance, fortitude, justice, faith, hope, and charity, and is thereby given a vocabulary and a discipline intended to remain at the core of his Masonic experience. Perhaps one of the most ironic things about the essence of manliness is that it doesn't have very much to do with maleness. In fact, when we speak of our essence in spiritual terms, we should recognize that since our essence flows from and is one with the divine, it must therefore transcend the duality of male and female, masculine and feminine. So we need to remain mindful that within each of us is the divine essence that transcends this binary. At the same time, each of us is somewhat uniquely composed by nature, nurture, and choice to manifest that essence's potentials in certain ways. We should also acknowledge the fact that none of our Masonic virtues or the intentions to embody them are the special domain of human beings who have testicles and carry Y sex chromosomes. So, while we look to other men for our role models of manliness, it behooves us to remember that we can find plenty of examples among women for each of the virtues we are charged to integrate into our lives as men. For this reason, among others, the fact that the cardinal and theological virtues are personified in feminine forms seems worthy of more than passing notice. They suggest that we must contemplate and actualize aspects of our humanity that aren't limited to stereotypes of masculinity if we are to reap the wages of mature masculinity. In short, achieving our greatest potentials with the virtues requires us to break through our generalized expectations of both femininity and masculinity. This work of integrating the virtues further connects with the allegory of the rough and perfect ashlars, where we learned that making space in our lives for development of the virtues requires not only that we divest ourselves of vices, but also of superfluities. In other words, we should free ourselves from attachment to anything that unnecessarily distracts us from refining ourselves in the spiritual, intellectual, emotional, and behavioral qualities we call virtues. Of course, one of the limitations of this allegory is that there are things that can seem like vices and superfluities at one time, and yet become realized as virtuous and even necessary at some other time. A commitment to ongoing contemplation, including the practice of mindfulness, is therefore crucial to determining what is necessary in any given moment. While there are generalizations we can make with regard to some hormone-related consistencies, we must realize most notions about masculinity for what they are: norms shaped within a particular cultural context, and thus understand that they may not be very useful to us as Masons engaged in the art of crafting a more authentic manliness for each of ourselves as individuals. Whether in our politics, spirituality, occupations, pastimes, or the way we behave in relationships, we are challenged by the allegory of the ashlars to realize that every time we fall back into the habits of some group's norms, we are then and there retiring from a more conscious and intentional approach to self-discovery and self-mastery. With regard to our gender identities, we should therefore be vigilant for and cautious about words in our mouths or our minds that include phrases like "a real man." Such language invariably attempts to codify generalizations as hard and fast rules about manhood. In short, It is complacent conformity with stereotyping, and it is a stereotyping that we are forcing onto ourselves and each other, thus denying ourselves the fullest possible latitude to become the unique man each of us can be. Masonry teaches us in many ways that we each have the opportunity, if not the duty, to liberate ourselves from confusing the adoption of such facades of masculinity with the art of knowing and expressing the true essence of manliness. Masonry urges us to take full responsibility for what the great depth psychologist Carl Jung called individuation, which is the process of becoming uniquely self-actualized human beings who, in our case, happen to be adult males. Now, the truth is that most of us do set our gavels down fairly frequently, and perhaps that can be especially tempting when it comes to our own manliness. But why do we do so? Surely sometimes it's simply because we need a break. We need to relax from our internal vigilance and enjoy some rest and refreshment. More significantly, however, we each still have a child inside with many hopes and fears. We should consider how many of those hopes and fears are woven together with all sorts of uncertainties. Facing those uncertainties almost always brings some degree of anxiety, and the natural desire to not feel such anxiety often motivates us to stop working on the rough ashlar. In short, we avoid really digging into the issues of our manliness and individuation because it can be scary, even if only unconsciously so. At some level of the psyche, we're not sure what we'll find or how it will all work out. Quite understandably, we are uneasy about how we might change and how others might react to those changes. For instance, people we want to like us or respect us might not do so after we change. Or values, feelings, ways of thinking, and behaviors that we currently find unacceptable might be realized as not only acceptable, but entirely necessary for our continued growth and maturation. All in all, it can simply seem easier to decide to wear a stereotype of masculinity rather than do the risky work of becoming a truly individuated man. Nonetheless, taking such risks is a vital part of the work we are challenged to perform as Masons. It is an unavoidable part of penetrating the mysteries. We can easily see how our quest for manly individuation leads us into far deeper and more essential matters. By diving deeply into contemplation of those childlike uncertainties about life, about the world, other people, truth, God, and about our gender and other aspects of who and what we really are, by courageously embracing these questions, many of which never leave us and are never finally answered, we begin to consciously penetrate the mysteries and enter into Masonic intercourse. In fact, when we are fully bonded with the mysteries, we not only penetrate them, but they also penetrate us. What we are really talking about here is the attraction and conjunction of opposites into a harmonious whole. Carl Jung recognized these dynamics are not only true in terms of our relationships with other human beings, but also of the inner relationships among aspects of the psyche, and even in our relationships with the great mysteries of life, such as deity. With these things in mind, I hope you find the sexual and romantic innuendos useful. So, back to penetration and intercourse. Let's examine how our experience of the Masonic mysteries is like falling in love and making love with the one for whom we feel so much admiration and affection. Very few of us plunged straight through that portal between those two lovely columns and into the lodge to immediately consummate our relationship with Masonry. First, we had to go through a courtship. Just take yourself back to that time in your affair with Masonry. Steeped in old customs, there was no way she was going to ask you to court her. With propriety and respect, you had to make the first move. You applied to the lodge, which was telling Masonry that you found her attractive and wanted to get to know her better and hopefully see where things might go. She smiled back and responded with an investigation. And if you were fortunate enough to approach one of her lodges that knew what it was doing, then you got acquainted with some of her members. You and she discovered more about each other's character, and you began to develop a sense of compatibility with each other. Only after it was clear that you were ready for a solemn commitment did she agree to open her sacred space and welcome you to come inside. I'd like to point out that outside of Masonry, we encounter feminine symbolism in reference to the fraternity as a whole. In addition to the associations previously listed, mysteriousness, beauty, desirability, it has been traditional to refer to organizations in the feminine. A feminine gender is also traditionally assigned to most things receptive and vessel-like, such as ships or buildings, and thus with our lodges and temples. After all, females are the ones with vaginas and wombs, the sacred spaces of flesh and blood from whence we are born and to which so many of us wish to return as often as our age and physical health allow. This symbolic connection of the lodge with the womb is important and has much to reveal. The womb, and also the tomb, is a place isolated from ordinary life in the world, and we have many such places in the legends of Freemasonry: lodges, sanctuaries, chambers, forest clearings, the highest hills and lowest vales, vaults, crypts, graves, caverns, and caves. Places like these always serve as locations for encountering the unknown, and so we often enter them with uncertainty and a willing vulnerability, in the dark, hoodwinked, or perhaps even in a death of some sort. They naturally evoke feelings of both hope and trepidation, and remind us that there is a very deep wisdom in not knowing what lies ahead, in contemplatively accepting and embracing awareness of mysteries just as they are, of allowing them to enfold us and to unfold us as they will. Insulated from the world, they give us opportunities to be fully present in the present, attending to the here and now moment without need to perfectly map it out in a context of past and future, a context that is always illusory to some extent. They reconnect us with the wisdom of patiently meditating upon paradoxes, of meeting the unknown with faith, intuition, and imagination, rather than always trying to fill in the blanks of our ignorance with the logical analyses, rational speculations, and calculated conclusions that don't actually work as often as we'd like them to. In short, these in-between places reawaken us to a way of being that, in our culture, is most often regarded as feminine and yet is part of our humanity that we must learn to embrace, to be comfortable with, and even to cherish if we are to become more whole, well-integrated, and individuated men. In Masonry, our acknowledgement of the importance of these so-called feminine qualities is very significantly found in naming ourselves sons of the widow or the widow's sons. So Masonry is thus not only a mystical lover and spouse, she is the mother of the new man we are each becoming, the widow of the man who has died in order to be reborn, as well as the virgin who bears witness to the loss of her betrothed suitor in this process. Womb to tomb to womb, and womb to tomb, again and again, in degree upon degree of illumination, Masonry is there to inspire us, receive us, nurture us, transform us, accompany us, let us go, and greet us in returning to renew the cycle with her. Is it any wonder that the artist Pamela Colman Smith placed the High Priestess between our Masonic columns for Brother A. E. Waite's tarot deck? Note that upon her head is a moon crown with its two crescents and single disk representing the lunar cycles of waxing, full, and waning, which are further associated with the menstrual cycles of women, as well as the traditional feminine life stages of maiden, mother, and crone. As the widow's sons, we can also find a parallel with our own ritual teaching about the phases of youth, manhood, and old age. But this imagery not only speaks literally to our physical aging, but also symbolically to cycles of psycho-spiritual and philosophical transformation. Our hearts and minds give birth to attitudes and ideas about who and what we are, about the nature and meaning of existence, and about God. Those attitudes and ideas wax, mature, wane, and either die or become part of the material that combines to give birth to a new self-concept and a new philosophy of life. Sometimes this whole process can happen fairly quickly, and in other cases can take many years. For some of us, especially those fully engaged with the mysteries, it is a process that may be repeated many times in one physical lifespan. Returning to Waite's very Masonic High Priestess, it is quite interesting that he, like other influential esoteric Masons of the so-called English school of the Tarot, and later Brother Paul Foster Case and others down to this day, associate her path on the Kabbalistic tree of life with the Hebrew letter Gimel. This path is the bridge between the heart center, called Tiferet, or beauty, the virtue of which is devotion to the great work, and Keter, the crown, where the virtue is attainment of mystical unity. This letter, Gimel, connects strongly with themes of movement and change. In Kabbalah, its name is often regarded as a reference to the word Gamal, which means camel, a creature referred to as the ship of the desert. Furthermore, the letter's shape is said to resemble a person taking a step. Gimel is also traditionally associated with the word Gemul, which means a just reward or consequence. Take note, you master masons traveling in search of a master's wages and the lost word. Beyond these associations, there is of course the fact that Gimel's Latin correlate is the letter G, which is in the east of our craft lodges. Please understand that I am not claiming the Masons who first introduced the letter G as a Masonic symbol were alluding to Gimel. Maybe they were, and maybe not. I don't know. Rather, as a speculative Mason, I am asking you to contemplate this symbolic connection and its significance with regard to the themes we are considering. And so I further note that other speculative Masons have also connected the letter G with gnosis. It is therefore very interesting to go back to the path of Gimel on the tree of life and highlight that it passes through a place on the tree called Da'at, which means knowledge, specifically mystical knowledge, which in Greek is called gnosis. But is all of this very far off from the two ritually taught meanings for the letter G, which are geometry and God? I don't think so. Consider what we are supposed to learn by the allegorical use of geometry. First, we are taught that geometry can lead us to discern that nature, with a capital N as in Mother Nature, is the handiwork of deity, an expression of the divine. Furthermore, the word geometry is itself a Greek compound built upon the word ge, which refers to the goddess Gaia. She is the feminine counterpart of the masculine god Uranos, and together they are the great Mother Earth and the Heavenly Father, represented by the terrestrial and celestial globes on the columns at our Masonic portals. In each of these ways, the letter G takes on its other traditional significance in reminding us of God. In addition to this significance, we are taught that Masonry is synonymous with geometry, and that geometry is enriched with the most useful knowledge, gnosis, knowing, dot, of both a divine and moral nature. Thus, it not only proves the wonderful properties of nature, but it also demonstrates the more important truths of morality. So how is it that geometry has anything at all to do with morality? What do geometry and morality have in common that can serve as the allegorical key to unlock this mystery? The answer is, in a word, relationship. In its most literal sense, geometry is the science of discerning and describing the physical relationships between objects in space, as well as the relationship among the various parts of the objects themselves. Likewise, morality is about the relationships among human souls, between them and deity, them and the world in which they live, and among the various facets of one's own soul. Thus the letter G, no matter how we regard it, Gimel, Gnosis, or geometry, directs us to contemplate our relationships with and thus to more deeply know deity, the world, each other, and ourselves. Following this path of deep knowing, we should more carefully consider the nature and identity of this widow who beckons us deeper into her mysteries. Is she a conceptual package of symbolic language and imagery that we use to personify certain qualities to be found in our tradition and integrated into our identities as men? She is at least that, but may well be very much more. We should remember that the sciences of psychology and sociology acknowledge that every group has its own collective mind, a kind of atmosphere of predominant values, beliefs, attitudes, and customs that has both conscious and unconscious dynamics and effects upon the members of the group. In Masonry, this is a part of what we are speaking about whenever we refer to our fraternal bond as the mystic tie. In the esoteric arts and sciences, we take things a step further and suggest that this collective mind may not only be an atmosphere, but that it can also develop into a living entity of its own, with its own drives to survive, flourish, and express itself. This psychic presence of a group is sometimes referred to as an egregore. In this regard, the mystic tie can be understood a bit more literally as mystical in nature, in that it has a metaphysical reality that transcends our nervous systems and social behaviors. But esoteric insight doesn't stop there, because in the Western esoteric traditions, we regard every soul as a vessel for the divine. This is related to a fundamental axiom of theurgy, which holds that when we properly construct an image for some divine being or archetype, then the genius of that being or archetype naturally inhabits it to some degree. It follows that the widow of whom we are all sons is not only a symbolic package, but also a group mind and an egregore that serves as a vehicle for divine being. We are now thrusting more deeply and directly into the spiritual dimensions of the mysteries, and therefore much of what I have left to say will touch on religion. As I do so, please note that I'm doing my best to be faithful to the Masonic practice of religious diversity and inclusion, rather than urging you to see things from one particular religious perspective. You are each most welcome and encouraged to make use of these ideas in a way that best suits your own conscience. So, what is that divine being we address as the widow, or more specifically, who is she? More than one Mason has been tempted to conclude that she is Isis, who was, after all, widowed with the slaying of her husband Osiris. And there are some interesting similarities between that legend and the story of our third degree. While that possibility may be attractive to some Masons, for me it is too connected with a single religious tradition and one that is far removed from the experience of most contemporary Masons. My inclination is to seek an identity for the widow that is consonant with the spirit of universal brotherhood and religious inclusivism that she has fostered in her lodges since at least the early 1700s. So, the question for me is if there is a personification of the divine feminine that reaches across the major religious traditions of the Western world. I believe there is, and I submit to you that the most ubiquitous name by which she is known outside our tradition is Sophia. Sophia is uniquely qualified to be the identity behind the veil of our widow because her name has a presence in Greek, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions. Among the ancient Greeks, she was the personification of wisdom itself. And as many of you know, our word philosopher is based on the Greek philosophos, literally meaning a friend or lover of wisdom. To many Kabbalists, Sophia is the feminine spirit of wisdom featured prominently in the book of Proverbs and other wisdom texts. She is also identified with the dark and beautiful lover in the Song of Songs and the Shabbat bride, as well as the Shekinah, the very presence of God in this world mentioned repeatedly in the Hebrew Bible. As an aside, in some old Masonic rituals, it is even stated that our emblem of the blazing star refers to Shekinah. Sophia's presence in Christianity is also diverse. In Orthodox and Roman Catholic Christianity, there is the legend of Saint Sophia. It might interest you to know that I chose today, May 15th, as the day to post this presentation because this is Saint Sophia's feast day in the Roman Catholic liturgical calendar. Saint Sophia was a martyred widow with 3 martyred daughters who are named Pistis, Elpis, and Agape, which in English are faith, hope, and charity. Among esoteric, Gnostic, and mystical Christians, Sophia is sometimes regarded as a name for the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. Bearing this in mind, take note of the similarities between the High Priestess of Brother Waite's Tarot and Sophia as she is frequently portrayed in Orthodox icons and statuary. She is robed, crowned, seated on a throne, holding a scroll or book, and often with a single saint or angel standing column-like at each side. In the Islamic mystical tradition of Sufism, The medieval Muslim scholar Abu Rayyan al-Biruni claims the word Sufi is itself derived from the Greek Sophia. Some Sufis therefore regard Sophia as the Greek name for Allah's feminine expression, whom the Sufi mystical lover may be fortunate enough to directly encounter in the form of a woman. We can see that Sophia is a name suitable to many religious traditions for a manifestation and expression of those aspects of deity that we commonly regard as feminine: vulnerable, receptive, fertile, nurturing, intuitive, imaginative, empathic, alluring, titillating, intoxicatingly desirable, and mysteriously wise. But why would any of this matter? Beyond some interesting esoteric musing, what is the practical value of regarding Masonry, the widow whose daughters are the virtues, as an embodiment of Sophia? That question takes us full circle back to the beginning of this journey. We started by probing the Masonic art of manly individuation and how it leads us through the facades of cultural norms and into mature individuated masculinity. We examined how this quest takes us to a place where we must begin to contemplate and integrate qualities that are not exclusively masculine in nature, and many of which are well exemplified by women, if not more commonly associated with them in our culture. Carl Jung would not only be in complete agreement with this, he would add that, as males, the very archetype of our own deep inner nature, the anima, Latin for soul, is feminine. He would remind us that our path to psychological, moral, and social wholeness and harmony requires the masculine personality's alchemical union with and transformation by the feminine anima. Sophia, as the spiritual being inhabiting our fraternity's egregore, has great power to further awaken each of us to the anima within, and then to nurture our alchemical union and transformation. Our courting of her, initiatic penetration of and intercourse with her, is an external and social corollary with the internal and psychological processes of integration and individuation. In other words, our initiatic ceremonies are outward and visible signs of an inward and spiritual grace. These internal and external factors can be experienced in a reciprocal dynamic, such that our relationship with the fraternity's egregore may not only respond to, but also stimulate what is happening between one's personality and anima. Simply put, phases of conflict, resolution, and harmony between one's personality and anima are likely to be accompanied by fraternal experiences of friction, negotiation, and cooperation, and vice versa. So it behooves us to engage in our relationship with Sophia in a more conscious and intentional way. By finding a historical name for the divine being manifesting through our fraternity's egregore, and one with a presence in other traditions, we allow her to be more real to us, more available for a truly personal relationship with each of us, and in ways that don't have to be in conflict with our various religions. It becomes much more natural to interact with her as a living being with her own life and intelligence, rather than treating her as a mere social phenomenon, or worse, nothing but a concept that must therefore be smaller than our own individual minds. And since esoteric metaphysics posits that she is indeed a living being, it becomes vital to treat her as such. After all, as gentlemen, shouldn't we at least know the name of our lover? As with a human lover, we must treat her with respect and dignity if we want to know her very well and have a fruitful and mutually beneficial relationship with her. But understanding the nature of Sophia as fully as possible doesn't stop with regarding her as the divine spirit veiled in Masonry's egregore. She is also in immediate communion with the Godhead, as shown, for example, by the Kabbalistic view that she is Shekinah, the esoteric Christian view that she is the Holy Spirit, or the Sufi view that she is the feminine manifestation of Allah. This possibility brings us back to Masonry's use of the terms mystic and mystical. Some Masons have tried to argue that these terms are only meaningful to us in their broadest significance of speaking to that which is mysterious. A few have insisted that the mysteries to which the terms mystic and mystical refer are no more than the signs, grips, words, and rituals we attempt to keep secret among us, and are thus supposedly mysterious to the profane. I find this to be an utterly ridiculous bit of reductionism that would suggest our early speculative leaders were either using such terms in nothing more than irreverent jest, or that they were simply unaware of their deeper implications. Given what we know of men like Hitchinson, Callcott, and Preston, neither of those suggestions is acceptable to me. These learned and spiritually minded men, and many other early Masons, would have understood that terms like mystic and mystical reference the spiritual realm of being, a realm that transcends the material and the social dimensions while also informing them. It also seems highly likely that many of them would have known that mysticism, as defined by Thomas Aquinas hundreds of years before them, was about attaining knowledge of the divine through direct experience of the divine. In this light, we should note that the ritual of Masonry speaks frequently about ways of knowing God, such as through the contemplation of nature and those inspired texts we refer to as the volume of sacred law. Yet the most common use of the term mystic in our tradition is when we speak of our mystic tie. If we are going to take this term seriously, then I suggest that our mystic tie, the fraternal bond, egregore, and spirit of Masonry, is herself a means of knowing God through direct experience in the social dimension of existence. For some of us, the possibility of directly experiencing God is a light we are drawn to as surely as a bee to a rose or as a lover to his or her beloved. We are mystics at heart, and we intuitively grasp that the meaning of our lives is centered upon knowing God as fully as possible. For us, God cannot be limited to the form of a remote and detached observer, simply waiting for our return upon death. We are driven to part the illusory veils between us and God, and thus strengthen our sense of oneness with God and each other. For us, penetration into the great mystery we call God is essential to our very sanity and our ability to be knowing workers with light and builders of love in this world. Beyond this, as Masonic mystics, I believe we should understand that this work is not only about the inward journey to intuit God's ineffable and imageless transcendence in the silence of our hearts and minds. Masonry's teachings neither specify nor allude to the kind of dualism that denies a spiritual value to fully engaging life in this world. For a Masonic mystic, it is therefore just as important to experience God's immanent presence in Mother Nature and also in ordinary human society. To ignore either the internal or the external is to deny and virtually fragment the whole of creation and our existence in it. Therefore, in her urging for us to know and serve God, Our Masonic widow, mother, and spouse doesn't admonish us to remain in the sanctum sanctorum, contemplating the profundities of her trestle board. Rather, she teaches us to move back and forth between the interior holy of holies and an active life in the external world, interweaving the internal and the external as more fully integrated and individuated souls, more inspired architects, and more virtuous builders of our relationships with God, the world, and each other. This view is somewhat like the Christian doctrine that regards the church as the mystical body of Christ. Sophia may therefore be regarded as an actual manifestation of God's wisdom that we can naturally relate to as feminine in form and character. Said another way, to me, Sophia is not a separate goddess, but as our mystic tie, she is an embodiment of the wisdom aspect of the one divinity that is the transcendent source and immanent essence of us all. Thus, my friends and brothers, I submit that whenever we meet as Masons, we are directly experiencing God's vital, dynamic, instructive, and supportive presence personified as Sophia. By embracing and uniting with her in a truly loving relationship, one not only physical but also deeply engaged in the heart and mind, we can be transformed into better versions of the uniquely virtuous men we have the potentials to become, and thereby become more effective instruments of light and love to others. To conclude, rather than say more about Sophia in my own words, I'm going to let her have the last word, as recorded in Proverbs chapter 8, verses 1 through 4 and 22 through 35. Doesn't wisdom call out? Doesn't understanding raise her voice? On the high roads along the way, she takes her place where the paths meet. Beside the gates leading into the city, she cries out at the entrances. She says, "People, I call out to you. I raise my voice to all human beings. The Lord created me as the first of his works before his acts of long ago. I was formed at the very beginning. I was formed before the world began. Before there were any oceans, I was born. There weren't any springs of water at that time. Before the mountains were settled in place, I was born. Before there were any hills, I was born. It happened before the Lord made the earth and its fields. It was before he made the dust of the world. I was there when he set the heavens in place. When he marked out the place where the sky meets the sea, I was there. That was when he put the clouds above. It was when he fixed the oceans in place. It was when he set limits for the sea so that the waters had to obey his command. When he marked out the foundations of the earth, I was there. I was the master builder at his side. I was filled with delight day after day. I was always happy to be with him. His whole world filled me with joy. I took delight in all human beings. My children, listen to me. Blessed are those who keep my ways. Listen to my teaching and be wise. Don't turn away from it. Blessed are those who listen to me. They watch every day at my doors. They wait beside my doorway. Those who find me find life. They receive favor from the Lord. That's the end of this presentation. Thank you for listening and reflecting on this speculative journey with me. I've included this bibliography slide for anyone interested in the texts that were influential on the development of the views I've expressed here. Once again, thanks for your time and attention. I wish you light, life, and love.